All right, welcome to the PHONEWORD Forum on Wednesday, September the 24th, 2014. It's almost 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and today we're going to be talking about fit-for-purpose broadband for business with some very special guests, including Martin Geddes of Martin Geddes Consulting and Hank Hultquist of AT&T. And we've got some other folks joining us. We have Michael Rothschild, who is active at the industry level with the Future Numbering Working Group, as well as he is with ATL Communications. And I think somebody else joined us on the conference bridge. Would you like to announce yourself?
Hi, it's Shauna Forshey with Sprint.
Hi, Shauna. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Shauna is also very active at various industry levels here in North America with numbering and represents Sprint in the numbering realm. And Shauna, are you one of the tri-chairs of the Future Numbering Working Group?
Not of that group, no.
Okay, you're the tri-chair of the numbering test bed.
At the Industry Numbering Committee, I'm a co-chair.
Okay, also of Inc. So,
yeah.
Great. So some other folks might join us. Let's see, I just got a message from Brian Tofig. Not quite sure what that was. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about fit-for-purpose broadband, which Martin Geddes is an expert in that area. And for those of you that might not know Martin, Martin has been writing and speaking about industry topics, and he's one of the people that I consider to be one of the real visionaries in this space, for sure. And I am delighted to introduce everyone to Martin Geddes, who will start us off today, and then we'll switch over to Hank Hultquist of AT&T, who is one of their leaders in the regulatory realm and policy realm. So, Martin, you posed 3 questions to get us started, and I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you. And if you will start with the first question. If there's anything else you want to say to sort of set the stage for the conversation, please do so. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Also, greetings to Hank and everyone else on the call. And greetings from London to everyone. I've been studying this area for over a decade now, and it's a very interesting and actually quite complex one. And anyone who thinks they've got simple, easy answers is probably wrong. To set the stage is that businesses want to interact with their customers, and to interact with their customers, they need to be able to do 3 things. They need to be able to connect to the customer, have some kind of conduit to the customer. They need to be able to interact with the customer, so it could be with an IVR or interactive SMS. They need to transact with the customer, which is to exchange information, like names and addresses or identity or even money. So that's the basics of business. And they want to do that efficiently, effectively, and securely. So we're all in the business of telecommunications, and we're interested in building products and services that service that need. And so the conversation we're having this evening is what kinds of products and services are actually fit for purpose for business use. And business use includes business to business as well as business to customer. And we're going to explore a little bit what it might mean. And to set up the conversation, put together 3 starting questions. Many of you will have seen the open roundtable forum at the FCC in the last few weeks, and you see many lawyers sitting around the table, and all credit to the world of lawyers. However, I'm a network performance scientist, and my first question is a very simple one, which is, are the proposed policies actually congruent with the real constraints and the actual operation of broadband networks. So are we sometimes, or some parties may be hoping for the equivalent of faster than light communication, and therefore their views maybe need to be tempered a little bit. So you hear lots of talk about fast lanes or not fast lanes. What's the truth? What's the actual performance boundaries and cost boundaries of these systems? And the second question brought up as a starting point for discussion, which is when we talk about toll-free broadband, we're implicitly working with a framing from the past, which is phone calls. But broadband is not about circuits and phone calls. Broadband is about packets. It's about sharing a medium using statistical processes. And we're also engaged in an era where we're not just moving the packets around. We have things like caches and content delivery networks and transcoding systems. So the question is what kind of regulation do we need that's actually fit for purpose for this era? So we're actually doing distributed computing, not just circuits. So what does that actually mean? And then the third thing I want to talk about, which is we have to be a little bit careful with toll-free. So the original toll-free voice offer was actually quite a subtle bundle of different things. So you had, yes, you had the reverse charging, but you also had an identity system in there, and you were forced to disclose your caller ID to the party, for example. So what is the set of capabilities or bundle of capabilities that are actually required? And in particular, when we talk about toll-free broadband, are we really confusing two different things here? One of which is about who pays for connectivity, but the other one of which is about performance, about assurance of performance, which we took for granted in the circuit voice world, but is not to be taken for granted in the broadband world. So what is it that we're making the offer for here? And is actually the toll-free concept potentially hampering our thinking and leading us down sort of legacy ways of thinking about the problem domain? So I hope this makes sense. Jay?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, Martin. Thank you for laying out those three questions in those three areas. And, you know, in many respects, in this entire conversation about fit-for-purpose broadband for business, when we're talking about toll-free broadband, when we're talking about, you know, priority, and zero rating and all that stuff. When we're talking about all that stuff, this is a very emotional topic. And as you point out, there's a lot of similarities between the past and the contemporary, and yet there are some significant differences.
Very significant differences.
That are subtle but profound. And in many respects, I think what part of the difficulty around this conversation is that people try to fit square pegs in round holes.
Right.
And it looks like the old square pegs should fit in the round holes, but they're totally different.
Right. So give me a few examples, maybe, of ways in which the problem domain is richer and more complex, and people they simply characterize it as fast lanes and not fast lanes. They've really missed the point. So give us some examples. Let's say you wanted to offer a toll-free like service for hosting. It could be small cells or some other kind of device in people's homes that was very timing sensitive. Well, that device might be sensitive to the continuity of service. So if you've got DSL lines or VDSL, there's line retrains, which cause little outages. That affects the fitness of purpose. Those line retrains also then cause variations in the packet serialization speed, and that affects the ability of things like timing protocols to work, and that affects its fitness for purpose. You have the level of stability of the service. So there's a technical word called stationarity, which is about the how stable the probability distribution of loss and delay is, and that affects the fitness of purpose. And that's just some aspects of how the network performance part works. That's not even thinking about the wider issues of terms and conditions, pricing, support services, or even anything to do with the wider world of distributed computing. But just in that tiny narrow slither of the network and how it performs, there's a whole bunch of characteristics which are relevant, which seem to be vastly oversimplified. And the key one that's oversimplified is about scheduling. And so people talk about fast lanes and slow lanes, and they fundamentally not understood the network is a trading space for resources, and these trades have to happen, and this is a finite thing, and not everyone can always be satisfied at once. And so it's very frustrating as someone who's steeped in the science of how the network actually works to see a debate at a level which is below what is actually required to understand it.
Absolutely. Hank, would you like to weigh in on, from the regulatory and policy standpoint, what your view is under the current situation?
Sure.
And especially what in light of what Martin has sort of laid out?
Sure. Thanks, Jay. I think Martin's points are very well taken and have, obviously significant implications for public policy. I think one of the challenges that we've faced in the public policy surrounding the growth of packet switch networks and the internet has been, it seems like for some people at least, there's an observation of the world and the network as it exists at a particular point in time and the business models that support that, and somehow that's viewed as an end state almost, that's a goal, that we should preserve that particular mode of networking and that particular set of business models. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do, because there's not any reason to think at any point in time that in fact you've reached an end state. And Martin's points about the fact that many of the people involved, and I count myself in this camp, don't really understand the science of networking adequately to make that kind of decision, counsels even further for caution. And I think that's the one thing we lack here is caution. There are a lot of people who have absolutely no humility regarding the correctness of their views. They're certain of them. And unfortunately, I think they're certainly likely to be wrong in many respects. So I think all of which is kind of a long-winded way of getting to the point of saying it's really important that we not freeze a particular form of networking or a particular set of business arrangements that underlie that form of networking, because there might be better ones that we could develop over time as we start to grapple more with some of the problems that we have, including problems Martin has talked about, like this idea of having fit-for-purpose service. And so that kind of is my view of this whole thing. I feel like people have developed policy views that are very entrenched well before we're actually in a position to have good, well-developed policy views by any of us.
Absolutely.
I absolutely agree. And before I turn it over to Martin, I'd like to make a few points on this. This is really an emotionally charged issue. The Federal Communications Commission has received over 3 million comments during their open comment period regarding net neutrality, regarding priority, regarding sponsored data, all these programs. And I think you're both making some really key points about how, the understanding is still very clouded around this whole issue. And the point I would like to make is that the stakes are really high here. because from what I've read that Martin has written, we are really approaching a critical time in the internet. And as we transition off of the public switch telephone network, which is becoming less reliable simply because for a number of reasons, but as we move into this realm of completely relying on the Internet Protocol network, and simultaneously as the demands on the Internet Protocol network are growing exponentially as the video appetite just continues to explode, these are really, really important issues and important policy elements. So I'm going to turn it over to Martin, having made those points, and let you go comment from a networking and technical and scientific view.
Okay, so I'm to pick up on what Hank was saying. So another way of saying what Hank was saying is this idea of the end of history illusion, which is we as individuals and collectively can look back at us as teenagers, and think, I was so naive. But we struggle to project ourselves forward the same amount into the future and realize that we will change just as much in the future, and so will our context. So what Hank was alluding to is the belief that whatever we have now is kind of some end game, and it absolutely has to be preserved and protected against some nebulous forces that will somehow take it away from us. And it's just not true. So the network architectures we're currently running with are in many ways 1970s lab experiments that have escaped. And there are far more advanced ones which are currently in development. Actually, name one. So recursive internet architecture. It's invented by John Day at Boston University and currently being developed by the EU under funding of EU projects. And so the danger is trying to lock in technologies and mistakes in those technologies that we have today and problems with those technologies. And we'll be living with it. If we try to lock those in, we'll be living with them for a very long time, not very costly. And what Hank was also talking about is the need for humility, particularly amongst some of the policy-making classes, because there's like this hierarchy. Okay, is at the outermost part of this hierarchy is what you might call cosmic constraints. Right? So the speed of light is a cosmic constraint, and not even Mr. Wheeler, in fact, not even Mr. Obama, can renegotiate that cosmic constraint. Okay?
Are you sure, Martin?
Sorry?
Are you sure?
I'll leave it as a exercise to the reader about how to be sure about it. It's between you and your deity. Okay? Okay. So then one step in from that is what we call ludic constraints. So broadband is a statistical game of chance, and that game has some rules to it, and that sets some boundaries as to what's possible. Okay? And so when I hear people saying no fast lanes, I'm thinking, you seem to be asking for something which is outside the ludic constraints of this object. I don't take you seriously. And then you go in a little bit further, and you have what are called ecological constraints. So constraints of law, of economics, of policy, but they can't override the ludic ones or the cosmic ones. Okay? And I sit kind of in the middle of these. I'm a mathematician by training, and I work with a team of applied mathematicians in performance. And it's about putting back into the debate and the policy-making process the reality of that ludic stuff. I'll give you an example of that. Let's say for a moment you have been tasked with coming up with a policy around for-purpose business broadband and making sure that people who've bought this broadband have got what they paid for. Yeah. Or the people who, that it was neutral in some way, some definition of neutral. Okay, how are we going to measure this? We need an objective measure so that if we go to court and we say, look, I bought this and I got that, I want my money back. Well, at the moment, the way that broadband works is that it's this large game, but the outputs of the game are what's called non-deterministic. So actually, a broadband network can actually do anything, and it's still legitimate within the game. because you have arbitrary bad coincidences happen and arbitrary oscillations and interactions. Anything can happen. Okay, so so you can't, in terms of developing an objective measure as to is this service delivering or not, you need to understand what are the rules of the game. And if you start to make rules which are not aligned with reality, this absence of reality-based regulation, well, reality is going to come along and interpose itself. It just isn't negotiable. So I think that the challenge is to invite people into the debate who really, really understand how the stuff works. And a good example of that is I've noticed, for example, many telcos don't necessarily have someone on their board who is a senior engineer. And I've read several books on network neutrality, all of which greatly impinge on this discussion, and not a single one of them has got a correct model of how the network works. And all of them have drawn incorrect conclusions about the policy you should therefore implement. Yeah,
and before I turn it over to Hank to comment on the excellent points that you've made, Martin, as I listen to the open or the roundtable discussions regarding the open internet at the FCC, there is a emphasis on measurement of where they're trying to measure quality of service, and rightly so, to assure that the consumer is getting what they're paying for. And the point you're bringing up is that the measurement methods are, let's say, suspect at best and faulty at worst.
Yes.
So, in your writings, the things that you've written, it's clear to me that there are multiple dimensions to measuring quality of service.
Correct.
And if you pick just one, that can be very misleading.
Yes.
And the other dynamic that's going on in the conversation that I've heard is, there's this fear out there that if there are fast lanes, if certain priority is given, that's going to degrade my service, which I'm paying for. And the interesting part about the debate and the conversation is, and this is my view, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's actually exactly the opposite. There's sort of this paradox, and it touches upon the tragedy of the commons, in my view, where it's actually the opposite. By giving priority to certain traffic, you actually can improve the quality of service of the people that are not paying for priority. Would you say that's correct, Martin?
You can give them a consistent application outcome at a much lower cost. So the mistake people make is to assume this is a cornucopia, and the network is capable of delivering unbounded levels of quality to everyone at all times, and it can't. It's finite. And what you have to recognize is something. A service like Netflix is basically a giant legitimized denial of service attack on every other user of the network. And it is, in the way the networks are currently constructed, it would not surprise me if Netflix go bust, because there is no way of delivering the quality of experience at a cost structure that's sustainable. Now, we could construct networks in a different way and give it a different cost structure, but they to me, are not currently carrying the true costs of what they do, because the cost is mismeasured. The cost that they impose is the access networks have to become extremely idle in order for the level of contention to be kept low enough for everyone else's application to keep on working. And that cost is not factored in. The opportunity cost is not measured properly.
Absolutely, I completely agree. So Hank, I'll switch over to you. Do you have any comments on what Martin's just laid out and basically some of the points that I made?
Sure, and I feel like I could comment for a long time, but I'll try not to comment for too long. I think one of the problems we have in the public discussion of these issues is our metaphors are not adequate to the task that's required of them. And so the discussion of fast lanes I find incredibly frustrating. I mean, the other day I suggested to someone we're going to roll out tachyon broadband so we can have faster than light transmission. And really, there's not, I think, at all an understanding that you can't make any packets move faster than others, that they're all bounded by the speed of light and the distance they have to travel and any delays they encounter along the way. So it's not really about fast lanes. It would be more accurate to talk about bumpy lanes or something else, some other metaphor here. And unfortunately, we don't have that. So the public discussion has been incredibly distorted by the use of bad metaphors, I think. And I don't know what we can do about that at this point in time. I think the measurement situation is just a great example of, that the saying about, why are you looking over here? Because that's where the light is. That's the thing they can measure right now. They don't have a sophistication, or they haven't looked for sophistication great enough to measure other things. And I don't know why that is. I don't know why people who are in the business of providing different services and applications don't think of ways to measure the extent to which their particular use case either is benefited or harmed by particular forms of networking and business arrangements. So that is certainly a frustration with the status quo. I guess over time, I remain hopeful that people will come to see some of these ramifications and see that it is really important to get past the slogans and the metaphors and to look more closely at what are the goals that we have for networking. What are the things we want to be able to do? What are the things that prevent us from doing those, the things that we would like to do or do better? And then talk about solutions rather than this very myopic focus on an imagined idealized state that likely is in fact not an ideal state.
Well, thanks, Hank. And I think that's why Martin's work is so important, because Martin has done an excellent job of outlining and articulating this, let's say, clouded parameters as well as the networking science behind the whole conversation. And before I turn it back over to Martin, I would just like to bring Michael Graves into the conversation, because Michael is an expert in video as well as audio connectivity and transmission. And we, during one of the recent VoIP user conferences, we were trying to connect to an event in Spain called TADHack, which is an awesome collaborative work developer event, and the demands on the Wi-Fi network were so great and the transmission was so bad that we couldn't use the connectivity. And for me, that was just a highlighted example of what we might be approaching in the general case. So, Michael, if you don't mind, if you would just talk about, quality of service in the video delivery realm, and maybe you don't have any comments, and I'm kind of calling on you impromptu, but if you could tell me about or talk a little bit about quality of service in the video delivery realm, any thoughts that you might have, I'd appreciate that.
Well, I come to this from a long history in broadcasting, which is networking, but in a very different context, unidirectional, if you will. Except that in the production realm, where things are being created, there was actually a lot of discussion going on at a very recent broadcast conference about how traditional interconnect standards are being replaced by all IP infrastructure, which is very interesting because we have seen in that realm for 20 years discussions of convergence, where everybody is saying, oh, well, it's all this different multimedia stuff, it's all coming together and it's all going to be over IP. And I think if you think that networks are struggling now, wait till all of the entertainment and sort of what is now in the broadcast realm wants to be an over-the-top player. I think things are going to get, forward-looking thinking now is going to be extremely valuable as that trend of everything over IP carries on. And it may not always be in the last mile where all the discussion at the retail end seems to be. It may well be back in the middle or in the core or between large businesses or in places where very high bandwidth connections are going to be necessary, even within somebody's plant. I think the kinds of things we're thinking about as an industry now will be useful at all different levels. And yeah, every convention organizer everywhere needs to pay better attention to their network strategy. Please.
Yeah, awesome. And what you're talking about, Michael, is to kind of distill it down into a simplified analogy. And again, analogies are only go so far in this conversation, but what's happening is, as Martin said, there's just more and more pollution happening. And as Martin said a little bit earlier, services that are high usage services like Netflix are effectively becoming like denial of service attacks on everybody else. So I'm gonna break a little bit and ask Michael or Shauna on the conference bridge, and I think somebody else joined. Do you have any questions or comments at this point? Anybody on the bridge?
This is Mike Rothschild. No, I'm good. I appreciate the conversation. Certainly you guys are bringing up some points that we hadn't considered.
Great. Okay. Martin, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And or Hank, do you have any burning items that you'd like to interject?
Yeah, I guess just to sort of follow on your point, Jay, I mean, I'm not going to go so far as to call, very popular things like Netflix the equivalent of a denial of service attack, but the reality is that the network business arrangements have basically evolved to give very good quality, frankly, for services like Netflix. We can do that, and we can probably even make it better. I mean, ultimately, we may be able to find ways to make that even better, but at the same time, the impact of that is definitely felt by other potential services and potential services, where the kinds of techniques that we use for services like Netflix aren't going to work. I mean, you can't cache a voice conversation. Real-time interactions between people on different parts of the globe, we can't reduce that distance. That distance is what it is. And to give those interactions adequate quality, we need to come up with mechanisms, other mechanisms, than the ones that may work for applications like Netflix. And the fear I have, of course, is that through policy and politics, we'll put in place institutions and rules that retard the ability to develop those mechanisms, and that would be a great loss.
Right, and and I know you probably want to comment on this, Martin, but before you do, part of what's being explored and sort of grappled with in this whole conversation is, how do you create policy that that allocates this bandwidth on a quote fair basis, and more importantly, how do you do that on a dynamic basis? And recently, I was in a grocery store, and there was a youngster, maybe, I don't know, 5, 6 years old, who was sitting there in the shopping cart watching SpongeBob SquarePants on an iPhone. And I was thinking to myself, man, that's a huge amount of bandwidth that's being consumed. And, you know, certainly delivering SpongeBob SquarePants to a 6-year-old in a shopping cart in the grocery store is, you know, a legitimate use of bandwidth. But when you start to think about, well, should that bandwidth usage take priority over, let's say, a medical teleconference that might be going on to somebody at home, or let's say if I want to have a video connection to my invalid grandmother, how are we going to decide this bandwidth usage on a dynamic, real-time basis? I think is a key question. And, you know, static policy by fiat, in my view, will fall short. So, Martin, I'm going to turn it over to you,
okay,
and let you comment.
So I'll link back to what Hank and Michael have said. So Hank was saying about how we fall into a trap by picking inappropriate metaphors, whether it's, you know, about lanes, or even the idea of bandwidth and prioritization, actually laden with subtle hidden meaning. So what networks are is option trading spaces, or future option trading spaces. And when you buy an ISP plan, what you're doing is buying the option to apply a load to a network and to receive certain treatment for that load. And at the moment, what we have is basically misconstructed options and mispriced ones. So what Netflix is doing is exploiting an arbitrage, a quality arbitrage that exists in the network at the moment. And it is unlikely to be sustainable. And a lot of the network neutrality campaign debate is around people trying to lock in their sense of entitlement to the arbitrage, to get super high quality, but at the price of that you get from high statistical multiplexing gain. And this can't be done. So what we have to do is actually separate out the different qualities and price them appropriately. We also need a trading platform, a trading space where applications can make appropriate choices as to whether they're willing to pay. So the SpongeBob SquarePants application needs to basically have a budget to it and say, yes, I'm willing to pay to use up this much of the customer's resource budget, and if it goes beyond this in a dynamic environment, I'm going to degrade or fail, and that's fine. And if you're in a conference venue, then I've been in conference venues where you've got one person who is maybe speaking over Skype as a speaker, and everyone else is in there typing notes and doing whatever they want to do. One of those people has to be served in a different way. And the difficult thing we're struggling to face is things must fail. They must fail. And the idea, the whole point of running a network is to try to load it up to the point of saturation. That's when you make money. And the moment you get to saturation, something has to go. And you've run out of either bandwidth or schedulability. There's kind of two resource limits. And some of the discussions and debates are phantasmagorical in that they're hoping for some cornucopia that does not and cannot exist. So the real question is, how do we go about structuring these options, and how do we go about exposing them and creating effectively a market in them, which is sufficiently transparent and fair and efficient. That is something which we've completely solved, basically, in the world of financial options. We know how to run a futures market for foreign exchange, and we've been doing it for decades, and we have all kinds of rules to stop people from cheating. We know how to do it. Like, it's not a big secret. And but it requires a reframing. And that takes us back to the fit for business stuff. So, for example, I was in a hotel in France a few weeks ago, and I was unable to access a transactional website properly. It kept failing because everyone else was doing YouTube, whatever, at that time of night. That was deeply not serving me. And in fact, my neighbours, probably if they'd known what the effect of their traffic was on me, would have happily yielded. But there was no mechanism for that, for the appropriate trades to take place, and to take place in a relatively automated way. So until we engage with that immutable, unchangeable reality of the nature of the trading space and the options that we build for it, we'll keep being in trouble. We keep talking about bartering, prioritization, and other terms which are at best only loosely related to the reality of the thing in discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I've heard in the conversation is this notion that if there's pay for priority, it will strangle the small business and the startup ecosystem. And in my view, I mean, not even going into the points that you're talking about, Martin, where everybody actually wins if there is some sort of market mechanism to allocate the bandwidth. But, if the option is available for small businesses and startups to pay for priority for their bandwidth, in my view, that's going to be a benefit to the small business and startup because they're not going to have a huge amount of traffic. They're not going to be competing with, a Netflix or whoever. They will be able to offer a priority, offer an attractive gateway to their business at a manageable cost, because at the startup mode, it's unlikely that they're going to be using huge amounts of bandwidth.
There's a critical thing people get wrong in this, which is they always talk about pay for priority, but they neglect in that framing that you can equally get a discount for yielding. And at the moment, the current situation, both you can't buy assurance at any price, and therefore, if you need assurance for your application to work, you're out of luck. Whether you're a big company or a small company, just tough. And it certainly isn't going to happen just magically by imposing rules across your fingers and hope that everyone's going to get fabulous quality at low prices. It just isn't going to happen. So there is a finite resource and there are trades, but every time you move the pollution away from some flows and move it onto others, you can actually move it onto others that can maybe tolerate it much more. And those people, for tolerating more of the loss and delay and the impairment, get a discount. So it actually makes a whole raft of applications that today are either priced out of the market or infeasible because they don't have the right technical structure. Feasible, but everyone wins.
Yes, absolutely, and I'll turn it over to you in a moment, Hank. But it really is a case where under this, let's say, commons model, where everybody gets the same treatment, it really is, in my view, a lose-lose situation. and it's not even a win-lose situation. It's more like everybody loses.
Yes. Yes.
And you know what we're talking about.
The only way to win, the only way to win is to be aggressive. So, so actually, the word denial of service attack is a bit laden, but it's all the protocols are designed to try to grab as much resource for myself as possible, and all we're doing is incentivizing ever more aggressive behavior.
Right. It also it becomes like an analogy like Chinese handcuffs, because the worse the transmission gets, the harder people to try to pour more bandwidth into it, which just exacerbates the problem. Versus what we're talking about in terms of prioritization and market mechanisms to do a real-time dynamic allocation of bandwidth, actually becomes like a dynamic traffic cop, real-time, if you will, to allocate the resource, the scarce resource, based upon a dynamic feedback loop. So Hank, it sounds like Mark.
First, I would say Martin's point about people overlooking that part of a more sophisticated model would empower users with data that does not need priority treatment. It would empower them to yield, which is a benefit to them, potentially, if the pricing signals work right. That point is incredibly overlooked in all these discussions. And it may, in fact, be the case that there's much more traffic in terms of volume that would be ready to raise its hand and yield than there is traffic that needs better treatment. So that point, I think, is very important and very much overlooked in most discussions of these issues. And then the other one, Jay, I would say, you just slipped into a form of discussing this issue that I think causes misunderstandings. And it's where you said treating everyone the same is what we get today. And I think what we really want in the long run is a system where everyone is able to have some of their data treated differently than other of their data. So that it's not a question of I'm going to treat Martin better than Jay. It's both Martin and Jay have some of their use of the network that requires better performance than other of their use of the network, and we need an end-to-end system with the right set of capabilities and price signals to make that happen. And so it's not like someone's being disempowered. Everyone's being empowered for use cases that today they're either not able to do or they do at a much greater price than might otherwise be possible.
Right.
Absolutely.
And critically, the role of the operator isn't just moving data, it's the market maker in the middle of that.
Yep.
It's the trading platform.
Yep. And so then the question becomes, okay, who's in the best position to be in that market maker element? And it's my view that this is another part of the elegance of a, let's say, a sender pays or toll-free data model, is that, you know, the companies are in a better position to do the dynamic analysis, the pricing, let's say, the bandwidth testing of needs. So what do I mean by that? I'll draw an analogy. Right now, we already have a toll-free data model. It's crude, but it's out there. And what's that? Well, what it is Starbucks. So if I want to use the internet, I can walk into any Starbucks and pretty much connect. It costs me nothing, maybe a cup of coffee, but Starbucks, in my view, is kind of a first step in a toll-free data model. Now, when you look at that, Starbucks is in a better position than I am to go in and negotiate rates with AT&T or whoever the broadband provider is, and in fact I think it is AT&T that provides the data connectivity at a Starbucks. And really, I think what you've been proposing, Martin, in a network architecture framework is very much akin to that, where the provider of goods and services actually becomes in a better position to manage the bandwidth and the data connectivity and the pricing and all of that, and actually takes a burden off of the vast number of consumers out there to provide that functionality. So is there anything you'd like to comment on in that regard, Martin?
So what you and Hank are raising is a question of power. In a B2B environment between Starbucks and AT&T, you've got plenty of big boys who know how to get into a room and negotiate as to what they want to happen over this network. And if Starbucks wants to arrange so that certain things work fabulously and have assured service performance within Starbucks locations, then I really struggle to see how a regulator should be getting in the way of that. And there's a whole supply chain, maybe other content providers involved in there as well. There's also the question of imagine myself in this house right now. Is if other people in the house start firing up, BBC iPlayer and YouTube and all kinds of things like going on and backups. I want this call to keep going. This is a business call, and I want to have some control over the order of failure. And there is an interesting question about how do we provide appropriate levels of empowerment to the user versus the content sources out there on the network. And there's all kinds of, I was watching the FCC open table discussions, and there's all kinds of shrill, people accusing each other of disempowering users and being, I'm the person who represents the consumer, no, I'm the person who represents, well, actually, it's a bit more nuanced than any of you have been painting, and a bit more complex. And until we understand the nature of the trades and how things fail, and how to organize the order of failure, and how to structure the options, it's like a childhood playground discussion. We're trying to the object under discussion is at the level of sophistication of the stock market or the futures trading platforms for foreign currency or derivatives. We're kind of, you stole my pocket money. It's like, oh yes, these two ways aren't matched. It's like we need to up our game in terms of the sophistication of discussion, because a lot of what I see at the moment just is it can't be resolved at that level of understanding.
Yep, agreed. Hank, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think so. Jay, the way you put it was maybe companies are in corporations are in the position to make this happen. I think I think of it more as entrepreneurs are the most likely people to figure out how to do this. Everybody who's successful today is successful within an existing sort of framework. And to my view, the way for this to happen is the people who operate networks obviously have to create capabilities, but then they have to expose those capabilities to entrepreneurs who are going to really be the ones who are willing to experiment, willing to crash and burn, and some of them will figure out things that actually work. And so I think the greater the capabilities that we evolve and that we put into our networks, and networks here includes computers, obviously, and then expose those capabilities to third parties and entrepreneurs, the sooner we'll start to see some of these things actually happen.
Yep. Agreed. And also, I think along those lines, Hank, is, and we've already talked about this earlier in the conversation, but to prematurely close out certain models, certain methods, including market methods, is, really would close off some avenues of innovation that could be very, very important. So, Michael Graves is, from, let's say, a consumer standpoint, is there something you're hearing out of this? What are you hearing out of this conversation that's, maybe appealing, scary, whatever?
Well, I think that there's a lot of trend in various different places to say a new realm of entrepreneurs are going to have to come forward to undertake this, which is a bit like saying evolution stops once you've become a dinosaur. And maybe that's true, but remember, it takes an extinction event, and so I think there's a little danger in saying that we expect this to come up from that place. Although tools and techniques may arise out of those places, but I expect that those would be uptaken by larger players very quickly. But yeah, and Martin's very good about this. All is it's as much business as it is technology based, and so I put a question to these guys: is the real danger we face regulating too soon? Is the real danger we face trying to act before action is really warranted, because we just don't know the scope of the Wild West that we face?
So, this is Hank. I mean, I would jump in to say that I think one of the problems we potentially face is that we will freeze certain kinds of business arrangements or networking models through regulation. And so, yeah, that's a real danger. I hope we don't do that. It counsels for really leaning more heavily on more abstract principles rather than more specific rules in general in this area, so that people have a chance to think about how do those principles apply in changed circumstances. And I hope we don't do that, but that's certainly a possibility.
I agree. Martin, you have any comments along those lines?
My feeling is it's important to regulate to allow a diversity of models to emerge. So, to give you a concrete example, was the Welsh Assembly funded my colleagues a number of years ago to build a high-performance ISP which allowed assured performance for two-way sign language for the deaf, because commodity broadband that doesn't offer the super stable frame rate that they want to see. And it can be delivered over a relatively low bandwidth DSL. And that was built, so it's actually the world's highest performance ISP. And that was possible because you could go and rent the local loops from BT OpenReach here in the UK, and experiment with whole new kinds of ISP. And you can experiment with whole new kinds of business model with relatively little encumbrance. So what I'm seeing over here is a diversity of technology models and approaches, and it seems to be working. It has downsides, but it seems to be working. It's about cleaving the thing in the appropriate place and regulating below that point, but not above it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Michael, I think what you bring up is, this is really a dance among three areas, kind of like a three-legged stool. One is the technology, which Martin's certainly an expert in. Two is the policy and the regulatory realm, which Hank is certainly an expert in. And the third is the business models. And all three of those have to sort of work together as we move forward with, how's this all going to work? How's it all going to come together? How can we have the optimal service so that if my children want to watch SpongeBob SquarePants in the supermarket while sitting in the grocery cart, they can do so, as well as if my parents, grandparents, whatever, need real-time monitoring for their health assurance. How can that all be sorted out? So we're at the top of the hour, and I want to thank each of you for participating in this conversation, and everybody that's watching online on the web and so forth, and that'll watch this recording. I think this is a very critical topic, and in particular, Martin, I would really like to acknowledge you for your dedication in this area, because I know, or in my view, you are very, very talented, and there's a lot of things you could be doing with your talent, and you have chosen, this along with HyperVoice to be sort of your calling. And so, I really want to acknowledge you for the dedication and the contribution you've provided in the conversation and, to the industry. So thank you.
Thank you as well.
So, Hank, anything you'd like to say to kind of close out?
Nope. Thanks a lot for inviting me, Jay. As always, it was an interesting discussion. Look forward to further ones in the future.
Great. Let's go to Michael. Michael, anything you'd like to say as we end the session?
Every time I listen to these guys, I learn something, and that's ever so valuable, so thank you.
Yeah. So, Martin, any concluding comments you'd like to make?
Yes, very short one, which I think it's, I would encourage people to stop trying to win debates and to start listening and learning, because I learn things listening to Hank's world, so issues about foreclosure or pricing, which I don't understand very well. And likewise, issues of network performance and performance hazards, which maybe the lawyers don't understand so well. I think what we need is more of a conversation of mutual learning and having a synthesized shared reality rather than trying to impose our own realities on each other.
Yeah, and I really think part of the conversation to move it forward is to appreciate what the concerns are on all the sides, because certainly I'm not interested in paying for some sort of service and then having my service impaired. However, I'm also interested in having all this work and work in the most efficient, optimized manner possible. So is there anybody on the conference bridge that has any comments, any concluding remarks? Okay. Thank you all again. Next month we have Dr. Robin Hanson scheduled, although I did get a message from him that we might have to push his conversation back, so I'll work that out with him. But for those of you that might not be familiar with Robin Hanson, he is a professor of economics at George Mason University, Hank, your alma mater. Yes. And he is an expert in prediction markets. And the nature of our conversation is about what could be put into place in network security from a market-based approach. So I'm looking forward to developing that conversation with Dr. Hanson, and this is, I think, will be kind of an opportunity to look at the realm of security and say, what could be created if we took a market-based approach. So that will be October the 29th, I believe, at 4 p.m. Stay tuned for some information regarding that. And then in November, we have some folks from the Czech Republic who run, from cz.nic, who run an independent enum registry that's the source of multiple countries around the world use their platform. And we'll be talking about them, about some of their experience in running an independent enum registry, the governance issues, the technological issues, and so forth. So that's what we have coming up on the PhoneWorld Forum. I appreciate everybody for participating, and unless anybody has any other comments, we will call it a day. All right.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Goodbye.